Robert Mitchell had always prided himself on being a good judge of character, but he'd been dead wrong about his own family. The irony wasn't lost on him as he lay in complete darkness, his expensive suit now wrinkled and dirty, his Rolex ticking away precious seconds in a wooden box 6 feet underground. The whole thing started 3 weeks ago during Sunday dinner at his mansion in Greenwich. His nephew Danny had been unusually quiet, picking at his prime rib while his sister Sarah kept checking her phone. Robert should have noticed the signs, but he'd been too busy talking about the new will he'd just signed. Stupid mistake. Uncle Rob, you know we've always been grateful for everything you've done for us, Danny had said, his voice careful and measured. Sarah nodded along, her manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany table. They'd grown up in his house after their parents died in that car crash 15 years ago. He'd raised them, paid for their college, given them jobs at his investment firm. Of course, Danny. You two are like my own kids, Robert had replied, cutting into his steak. He'd never married, never had children of his own. These two were his legacy, his heirs. Or so he thought. The conversation that followed should have been his first red flag. Sarah mentioned how hard it must be for him to manage everything alone at 62. Danny suggested maybe it was time to think about retiring, letting the younger generation take over. They were so concerned about his health, his stress levels, his long hours at the office. We just worry about you, Uncle Rob, Sarah had said, her green eyes filled with what he now realized was fake concern. You work too hard. You deserve to enjoy your golden years. He'd laughed it off, told them he wasn't ready to slow down yet. The company was his baby, his life's work. Mitchell and Associates had grown from a small investment firm to a major player in the financial world, worth over $50 million. He wasn't about to hand it over just because he'd hit his 60s. That night, he'd gone to bed feeling good about family dinner, about having people who cared about him. 3 days later, he'd gotten a call from Danny asking him to meet at the old warehouse district downtown. Something about a potential real estate investment, a property that could be perfect for their expansion plans. Robert had driven there himself, parking his Mercedes near the abandoned buildings that lined Riverside Avenue. The area had been industrial once, but most of the factories had closed down years ago. Now it was just empty lots and crumbling concrete, the kind of place developers either avoided or saw as gold mines. Danny was waiting for him near a chain-link fence, wearing jeans and a baseball cap instead of his usual business attire. Thanks for coming, Uncle Rob. I know this seems sketchy, but trust me on this one. The next thing Robert remembered was waking up in absolute darkness, his head pounding from whatever they'd used to knock him out. His hands were tied, his mouth taped shut, and he was lying in what felt like a wooden box barely bigger than his body. The smell of fresh earth filled his nostrils, and the horrible realization hit him like a freight train. They'd buried him alive. He'd screamed until his throat was raw, even with the tape over his mouth. He'd kicked and punched at the wooden walls until his knuckles bled. But the sound was muffled, absorbed by the dirt above him. Nobody could hear him. Nobody was coming. The panic came in waves. First the disbelief, then the rage, then the crushing despair. His own nephew and niece had done this to him. The kids he'd raised, loved, provided for. They'd drugged him and buried him in some godforsaken lot, probably already making plans to declare him missing, maybe dead. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time had no meaning in the darkness. His watch had stopped working, probably damaged during the struggle. He couldn't remember. His phone was gone, of course. They weren't stupid enough to leave him with a way to call for help. He thought about the will he'd signed just weeks before. Sarah and Danny were his sole beneficiaries, set to inherit everything when he died. The company, the house, the investment portfolio, all of it. $50 million split between two people who'd apparently decided they didn't want to wait for him to die naturally. Maybe he should have seen it coming. Danny had been asking a lot of questions about the business lately, wanting to know about client accounts and investment strategies. Sarah had been pushing him to update his estate planning, suggesting he work with her lawyer friend instead of his longtime attorney. They'd been positioning themselves, learning what they needed to know to take over when he was gone. The worst part wasn't the betrayal, though that cut deep enough. It was the loneliness. Lying there in the dark, Robert realized he didn't have anyone else. No wife, no children, no close friends who would miss him right away. His social circle consisted mainly of business associates and country club acquaintances. People who might wonder where he was after a week or two, but wouldn't think to call the police. Danny and Sarah could probably keep up the charade for months. Tell people he was traveling, taking some time off, finally learning to relax like they'd been suggesting. By the time anyone got suspicious, they'd have had plenty of time to transfer assets, change passwords, and make themselves indispensable to the company's operations. He'd made it too easy for them. All those years of treating them like his own children, giving them access to everything, trusting them completely. He'd signed his own death warrant by being a good uncle. The wooden box felt smaller with each passing hour, the air thinner and staler. Robert tried to stay calm, to think of a way out, but the darkness was starting to play tricks on his mind. He'd hear sounds that weren't there, see lights that couldn't exist. His body ached from lying in the cramped space, his mouth was dry as sand, and hunger was starting to gnaw at his stomach. This wasn't how he'd imagined his life would end. He'd always figured he'd go out peacefully in his sleep, maybe in his own bed surrounded by the family he'd cared for. Instead, he was going to die alone in the dark, killed by the very people he'd loved most in the world. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. Robert had started to accept that he was going to die down there when he heard the first scraping sound above him. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him again. The darkness had been messing with his head for what felt like days, making him hear voices and see flashes of light that couldn't possibly be real. But this sound was different. Rhythmic. Deliberate. Someone was digging. He held his breath, afraid that moving or making noise might scare away whoever was up there. The scraping continued, getting closer, dirt falling through tiny gaps in the wooden planks above his head. Then he heard a voice, young and feminine, talking to herself. "What the hell is this doing here?" the voice muttered. "Ground's all messed up like someone's been digging already." Robert's heart pounded so hard he was sure it would give him away. He wanted to scream, to bang on the wood, to do anything to let her know he was down there. But something held him back. What if she got scared and ran? What if she thought he was some kind of criminal buried here for a reason? The digging continued. The girl kept talking to herself, complaining about how hard the dirt was, wondering why someone would bury trash in an empty lot. She had no idea she was saving a man's life with every shovel full of earth she moved. "This better not be some dead animal," she said, and Robert almost laughed despite everything. If only she knew. When the shovel finally hit wood, the sound rang out like a church bell. The digging stopped abruptly, and Robert could practically feel the girl's confusion through the dirt above him. "What the?" she said, and then there was more frantic digging, faster now, as if she'd realized what she might have found. When the wooden lid finally cracked open and Robert saw his first glimpse of daylight in days, he thought he might be hallucinating. The face looking down at him belonged to a girl who couldn't have been more than 13 or 14, with tangled brown hair and dirt smudged across her cheeks. She was skinny as a rail, wearing an oversized hoodie that had seen better days and jeans with holes in the knees. They stared at each other for a long moment, both too stunned to speak. Then the girl stumbled backward, dropping her makeshift shovel. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. "You're alive." Robert tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. His throat was raw from dehydration and the tape they'd used to gag him. The girl looked like she was about to run, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Wait," he managed to rasp. "Please don't go." She hesitated, looking around the empty lot as if expecting someone to jump out and explain what was happening. They were in an industrial area on the outskirts of Hartford, surrounded by abandoned buildings and overgrown weeds. Not the kind of place where people usually went for help. "Who are you?" she asked, keeping her distance. "Why were you buried there?" Robert tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, and his head felt like someone was hitting it with a hammer. He'd been lying in that cramped box for at least 3 days, maybe 4. His body wasn't cooperating with his desperate need to get out of that hole. The girl watched him struggle for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. She came closer, offering him her hand. "Come on, old man. Let's get you out of there before someone comes back." Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so small, and between the two of them, they managed to get Robert out of what would have been his grave. He collapsed on the ground next to the hole, breathing fresh air for the first time in days. It tasted better than the most expensive wine he'd ever had. "Thank you," he said, his voice still barely a whisper. "You saved my life." The girl studied him with sharp blue eyes that seemed too old for her face. "Yeah, well, Don't thank me yet. We need to figure out what to do with you." She looked around the empty lot again, then back at Robert. He must have been quite a sight, with his expensive suit now torn and filthy, his gray hair matted with dirt, his face probably looking like death warmed over. "You got people after you?" she asked bluntly. "Is that why you were down there?" Robert nodded, not sure how much to tell her. The truth was complicated, and he wasn't sure she'd believe him anyway. Who would believe that a wealthy businessman's own family had tried to murder him for his money? "Family," he said simply, and something in his voice must have conveyed the depth of the betrayal because the girl's expression softened slightly. "Yeah, I get that," she said. "Family can be the worst kind of enemy sometimes." She helped him to his feet, steadying him when he swayed. "My name's Chloe," she said, "and you look like hell, so we need to get you cleaned up and fed before you keel over." "Robert," he replied, "and I don't have anywhere to go. They probably think I'm dead by now, and if they see me—" Chloe nodded like she understood perfectly. "Yeah, going home's not an option. I figured." She looked him up and down, taking in his expensive clothes and watch. "You got money on you?" Robert checked his pockets and found his wallet was gone, along with his phone and keys. Danny and Sarah had been thorough. "No, they took everything." "Of course they did." Chloe shrugged like this was just another Tuesday for her. "Well, lucky for you. I know how to live on nothing. Come on, there's an old gas station about a mile from here where we can hole up for the night." As they walked away from the lot, Robert kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see Danny or Sarah's car pulling up. But the area stayed empty, just broken concrete and weeds swaying in the afternoon breeze. "How did you find me?" he asked as they walked. Chloe kicked at a rusty can, sending it clattering across the pavement. "I wasn't looking for you, if that's what you mean. I was checking out the lot, seeing if there was anything useful buried there. Sometimes construction crews dump stuff and forget about it." She glanced at him sideways. "Guess I found something useful after all. You live around here?" "I live wherever I can," she said matter-of-factly. "Been on my own for about 2 years now. You learn to survive, or you don't." There was something in her tone that told Robert not to push for more details, at least not yet. She'd saved his life, and now she was helping him stay hidden. That was more kindness than he'd gotten from his own flesh and blood. The abandoned gas station she led him to had been closed for years, but someone had left the door to the back office unlocked. Chloe had obviously been there before, because she went straight to a corner where she'd stashed some supplies. A couple of blankets, some canned food, matches, and a few other odds and ends. "It's not the Ritz," she said, spreading out one of the blankets, "but it's dry and nobody bothers you here." Robert sat down heavily, his body finally giving in to the exhaustion and trauma of the past few days. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. Chloe was opening a can of beans with a rusty opener, not looking at him. "Maybe because nobody helped me when I needed it," she said quietly. "Maybe because you look like someone who's had his whole world pulled out from under him, and I know how that feels." She handed him the can and a plastic spoon. The cold beans tasted like the best meal he'd ever had. "Besides," she added with a slight smile, "it's not every day you dig up a buried businessman. Kind of makes life interesting." Robert woke up the next morning feeling like he'd been hit by a truck, but at least he was alive to feel it. Chloe was already awake, sitting by the window of the abandoned gas station office, eating what looked like stale crackers for breakfast. "Morning, sunshine," she said without looking at him. "You snore, by the way." He sat up slowly, his body still protesting every movement. In the daylight, he could see Chloe more clearly. She was definitely younger than he'd first thought, maybe 13 at most, with the kind of sharp awareness in her eyes that came from living on the streets. Her clothes were clean but worn, patched in places, and her sneakers had holes that she'd tried to cover with duct tape. "How long have you been living like this?" he asked, accepting the crackers she offered him. "Long enough." She turned away from the window. "Question is, what are you going to do now? You can't stay buried forever, and you can't go home." Robert had been thinking about that all night, when he wasn't having nightmares about being trapped in the box. Danny and Sarah probably thought they were home free by now. They'd had time to start covering their tracks, maybe even filing a missing person report to make themselves look innocent. "I need to figure out who I can trust," he said. "Maybe my lawyer, or someone at the company who isn't connected to my family." Chloe snorted. "Rich guy problems. Let me guess, you got a company and everything." Robert hesitated. He'd been deliberately vague about who he was, partly because he wasn't sure she'd believe him, and partly because he liked how she treated him like just another person in trouble. When was the last time someone had talked to him without wanting something? Something like that, he said finally. Well, while you're figuring out your trust issues, you need to learn how to stay invisible. Can't have you walking around looking like a rich businessman who just crawled out of a grave. She was right. His suit was ruined, but it was still obviously expensive. His shoes alone probably cost more than most people made in a week. Even cleaned up, he'd stand out like a sore thumb in this part of town. First things first, Chloe said, standing up and brushing cracker crumbs off her jeans. We need to get you some different clothes. There's a Goodwill about 6 blocks from here that gets decent donations sometimes. They walked through neighborhoods Robert had never seen before, even though he'd lived in Connecticut his whole life. Rundown apartment buildings with laundry hanging from fire escapes, corner stores with barred windows, vacant lots where kids played with whatever they could find. It was like discovering a whole different world that existed parallel to his own. You're staring, Chloe said when they stopped at a traffic light. I'm sorry. I've never really been in this part of the city before. She gave him a look that was half amused, half disgusted. Let me guess. You live in one of those big houses in West Hartford or Greenwich, right? Never had a reason to come down here where the real people live. Robert felt his face flush. She wasn't wrong. His mansion in Greenwich might as well have been on another planet from where they were standing now. It's not that I didn't care, he said defensively. My work kept me busy. Yeah, well, welcome to the real world, Chloe said as the light changed. Try not to look so shocked by everything, or people are going to know you don't belong. At the Goodwill, she helped him pick out clothes that would help him blend in. Worn jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, a denim jacket that had seen better days, and a pair of work boots that were scuffed but comfortable. The total came to less than $20, paid for with crumpled bills Chloe pulled from various pockets. I'll pay you back, Robert said as they left the store. With what? You're broke, remember? She looked at him sideways. Besides, consider it an investment. If you're going to hang around, you need to not look like someone who's going to get us both robbed. They spent the rest of the day with Chloe showing him the basics of street survival. Which dumpsters behind restaurants were worth checking for food that was still good. Which public bathrooms were safe to use and which ones to avoid. Where you could sleep without being hassled by cops or worse. The trick is to be invisible, she explained as they sat on a bench in a small park, sharing a sandwich she'd bought with her remaining money. Don't make eye contact, don't cause trouble, don't stay in one place too long. People see what they expect to see, and they expect homeless people to be invisible, so that's what you become. Robert watched her as she talked, amazed by how someone so young had learned to navigate such a harsh world. How did you end up on your own? He asked gently. Chloe was quiet for a long time, tearing her half of the sandwich into small pieces. Mom died when I was 11, she said finally. Overdose. Dad split when I was little, and Mom's boyfriend didn't want me around after she was gone. Foster care was not good, so I left. Where did you go? Nowhere at first. Just walked around the city, slept in doorways, ate whatever I could find. She shrugged like it was no big deal, but Robert could see the pain she was trying to hide. Met some other kids in the same situation. We looked out for each other for a while, but groups don't last on the street. Too much drama, too many problems. Easier to be on your own. That's no life for a kid. It's the life I got. Her voice was matter of fact, but there was steel underneath it. Could be worse. At least nobody's hitting me or doing other things they shouldn't. At least I'm free to make my own choices, even if they're all bad ones. Robert felt something twist in his chest. Here was a kid who'd been abandoned by everyone who should have protected her, and she was helping a complete stranger just because it was the right thing to do. Meanwhile, his own family had tried to kill him for money. You're stronger than most adults I know, he said quietly. Chloe looked at him with surprise, like kindness was something she wasn't used to receiving. Yeah, well, you learn fast out here, or you don't learn at all. That night, they found shelter in an abandoned building that Chloe said was safe. Other homeless people had been there before, leaving behind some furniture and supplies that made the place almost livable. Robert lay on a mattress that had seen better days, staring up at the ceiling and thinking about how dramatically his life had changed in just a few days. A week ago, he'd been Robert Mitchell, successful businessman, living in a mansion and driving a Mercedes. Now he was Bob, a guy on the run from his own family, sleeping on a dirty mattress in an abandoned building with a 13-year-old girl who'd saved his life. The weird thing was, despite everything that had happened, he felt more awake than he had in years. More present. When you had to worry about where your next meal was coming from, you didn't have time to think about quarterly reports or investment portfolios. When someone showed you kindness without expecting anything in return, it meant something different than the calculated pleasantries of business meetings. You awake? Chloe's voice came from across the room, where she'd made her own bed out of blankets and cardboard. Yeah, you're not what I expected when I dug you up. Robert almost smiled. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone harder, I guess. More angry. Most people who end up buried alive by their own family, they come out wanting revenge. Maybe I do want revenge, Robert said. I just don't know what kind yet. Fair enough. There was a rustling sound as Chloe settled into her makeshift bed. Just remember, revenge is a luxury. Survival comes first. Robert thought about that as he finally drifted off to sleep. Chloe was right, as usual. Danny and Sarah could wait. Right now, he had more important things to figure out, like how to live in a world where people helped each other just because they could, not because there was something in it for them. It was a strange education for a man who thought he already knew everything about life. By the end of his first week on the streets, Robert had learned more about survival than he'd learned about living in 62 years. Chloe was a good teacher, patient when he made mistakes, and quick to correct him when he did something that might get them noticed. But she was also getting restless. We can't keep doing this forever, she said one morning as they sat in the doorway of a closed bookstore, watching the early commuters hurry past with their coffee and briefcases. Winter's coming, and this setup only works when it's warm enough to sleep outside. Robert knew she was right. It was mid-September now, and the nights were already getting colder. He'd grown up in New England. He knew what winter could do to people without proper shelter. But more than that, he could see the strain this was putting on Chloe. She'd been managing fine on her own before he came along, but now she was taking care of two people instead of one. I've been thinking about that, he said, pulling his denim jacket tighter around himself. I need to make contact with someone I can trust. Yeah? Who? Robert had been mulling this over for days. His lawyer, Jim Hartwell, had been handling his affairs for over 20 years. If anyone would believe his story and help him figure out what Danny and Sarah had been up to, it would be Jim. The trick was making contact without tipping off his nephew and niece. My attorney, he said, but I can't just walk into his office. Danny and Sarah probably have people watching anyone I might contact. Chloe nodded like this made perfect sense to her. So you need a middleman. Someone they wouldn't expect. Exactly. She was quiet for a while, watching the traffic. Then she turned to him with a look he'd learned to recognize. It meant she'd had an idea, probably a crazy one. I could do it, she said. Absolutely not. Hear me out. I'm just some street kid, right? Nobody's going to think twice about me walking into a law office. I could say I'm delivering a message for someone. Get your lawyer guy alone. Tell him you're alive. Robert shook his head. It's too dangerous. If they figure out you're connected to me, they won't. I'm good at this stuff, remember? Besides, what other choice do you have? She had a point, but Robert hated the idea of putting her at risk. This girl had already saved his life once. He couldn't ask her to do it again. Let me think about it, he said. That afternoon, while Chloe was off checking her usual spots for useful discarded items, Robert walked to the public library downtown. He'd been avoiding places where he might be recognized, but he needed information, and the library had computers with internet access. Using a guest account, he searched for news about himself. What he found made his blood run cold. The headlines were everywhere. Prominent businessman missing. Search continues for Robert Mitchell. Family fears the worst. Danny and Sarah had played their parts perfectly. In interview after interview, they appeared devastated by their uncle's disappearance. Sarah even cried on camera, talking about how much he meant to them, how worried they were. But it was the financial news that really got his attention. Mitchell and Associates stock had taken a hit initially when news of his disappearance broke, but it had recovered quickly. Danny had been quoted as saying that while they all hoped for Robert's safe return, the company was in good hands and would continue to operate normally. Already, they were positioning themselves as the natural successors. Danny had been named interim CEO, with Sarah handling the financial side of things. The board of directors, most of whom Robert had handpicked over the years, seemed to be going along with the transition smoothly. Robert dug deeper, looking at financial records that were publicly available. In the past week, there had been several significant transactions. Nothing illegal on the surface, but patterns that suggested Danny and Sarah were moving quickly to consolidate their control. They weren't just waiting for him to be declared dead. They were actively taking over his life. When Chloe found him at the library an hour later, he was staring at the computer screen with a mixture of rage and admiration. His nephew and niece had planned this perfectly. If he hadn't been rescued by pure chance, they would have gotten away with it completely. "Find what you were looking for?" Chloe asked, sliding into the chair next to him. "More than I wanted to." Robert showed her the articles, explaining what he was seeing in the financial reports. Chloe listened with the same focused attention she gave to everything that might affect their survival. "Smart," she said when he finished. "Evil, but smart. They're not just stealing your money, they're stealing your whole life. And doing a damn good job of it." Chloe leaned back in her chair, studying him. "So what are you going to do about it?" That was the question, wasn't it? Robert had been thinking about revenge, about justice, about making Danny and Sarah pay for what they'd done. But sitting there in the library, surrounded by people going about their normal lives, he realized his thinking had been too small. "I'm going to take it back," he said quietly. "All of it. But not the way they'd expect." "Meaning?" Robert turned to look at her, this skinny 13-year-old who'd become his closest friend and most trusted advisor. "Meaning I'm going to come back from the dead. But I'm going to do it as someone they don't recognize." Chloe's eyes lit up with interest. "Keep talking. They think they know me. Rich businessman, predictable, probably soft from years of luxury. They're counting on me being the same person I was before." Robert gestured at his thrift store clothes, his scruffy beard, his hands that were now calloused from a week of hard living. "But I'm not that person anymore. So you're gonna what? Walk back into your old life and surprise them?" "Eventually. But first, I need to understand exactly what they've been doing, who they've been working with, how deep this goes. And I need to do it without them knowing I'm alive." Chloe nodded slowly. "That's where your lawyer friend comes in. Jim Hartwell. He's been my attorney for 20 years. If anyone can help me figure out the legal side of this mess, it's him." "And you still want me to make contact?" Robert hesitated. Every instinct told him to keep Chloe out of this, to find another way that didn't put her in danger. But the practical part of his mind, the part that had built a $50 million company from nothing, knew she was right. She was the perfect messenger, someone Danny and Sarah would never suspect. "If you're willing to do it," he said finally. "But we do it my way, with precautions. I won't have you getting hurt because of my family problems." Chloe grinned, and for a moment, she looked like the kid she should have been instead of the street-smart survivor she'd been forced to become. "Don't worry about me, old man. I've been taking care of myself a lot longer than you have." They spent the rest of the afternoon planning. Robert wrote out a detailed message for Jim, including information that only he would know, details that would prove he was alive and that this wasn't some kind of scam. Chloe studied the layout of the law firm's building, planning her approach and her escape route. "You really think this'll work?" she asked as they walked back to their current hideout, an abandoned warehouse near the railroad tracks. "I think it's our best shot," Robert replied. "Jim's a good man. If anyone can help us figure out how to beat Danny and Sarah at their own game, it's him." That night, as they settled into their makeshift beds, Robert found himself thinking about something Chloe had said earlier. She was right that Danny and Sarah weren't just stealing his money. They were stealing his entire identity, erasing him from his own life. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that burying him would be enough, that he'd either die down there or come crawling back as the same broken man they'd betrayed. Instead, they'd created something they weren't prepared to deal with, a version of Robert Mitchell who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Chloe left for downtown Hartford at 8 in the morning, dressed in the cleanest clothes she owned and carrying a manila envelope with Robert's message inside. She'd practiced her story a dozen times. She was delivering a message for a man who couldn't come himself, and it was important that she speak directly to Mr. Hartwell. Robert waited in the warehouse, pacing back and forth between stacks of old shipping containers. He'd never felt more helpless in his life. For the past week, he'd been learning to rely on Chloe's street skills, but this was different. This was his world she was walking into, full of people who might recognize her later, security cameras that would record her face, receptionists trained to ask questions. If something went wrong, if Danny and Sarah somehow figured out what was happening, Chloe would be in serious danger. and it would be his fault. 3 hours felt like 3 days before she finally returned, slipping through the warehouse's broken loading dock door like a shadow. The grin on her face told Robert everything he needed to know before she said a word. "Mission accomplished," she announced, pulling a sealed envelope from inside her jacket. "Your lawyer friend wants to meet you tonight." Robert's hands shook slightly as he opened Jim's response. The handwriting was definitely his attorney's, and the tone was pure Jim Hartwell. Cautious, professional, but clearly shaken. "Robert, if this is really you, thank God you're alive. Danny came to my office yesterday asking about your will and some business arrangements. Something felt wrong about the whole conversation. Meet me at the old diner on Maple Street tonight at 9. Come alone, and for God's sake, be careful. If what you've told this young lady is true, you're in more danger than you know." "Jim, he believed you," Robert said, looking up at Chloe with amazement. "Of course he did. I can be very convincing when I need to be." She flopped down on the crate they'd been using as a chair. "Nice office, by the way. Real fancy. The receptionist tried to give me the runaround, but I told her it was about a missing person case, and I'd wait all day if I had to." "You didn't have any problems?" "Nah, though there was this weird moment when I was leaving. Saw a guy in the lobby who looked familiar, but I couldn't place him." Chloe frowned, trying to remember. Young guy, expensive suit, kind of cocky looking. Robert's blood went cold. Brown hair, about 6 feet tall, probably driving a BMW? "Yeah, that sounds right. You know him?" "That's Danny. My nephew." Robert started pacing again, his mind racing. What was he doing there? Maybe the same thing I was. Maybe he's keeping tabs on your lawyer friend, making sure nobody contacts him about you. The thought made Robert sick. If Danny was watching Jim, then tonight's meeting could be a trap. But they'd come too far to back down now, and Jim was his only real ally in the legitimate world. "We need to be extra careful," he said. "If Danny suspects anything." "Hey." Chloe stood up and put a hand on his arm. "Don't go borrowing trouble. Maybe the guy was there for something completely different. Rich people probably need lawyers all the time, right?" She was trying to reassure him, but Robert could see the concern in her eyes. Chloe had survived on the streets by being paranoid, by assuming the worst and preparing for it. If she was worried, he should be terrified. They spent the afternoon scouting the area around the diner Jim had suggested. It was a 24-hour place in an older part of town, the kind of spot where night shift workers grabbed coffee and truckers stopped for meals. Not the sort of place where Robert Mitchell would normally be seen, which made it perfect for their purposes. Multiple exits, Chloe noted as they walked around the building. Back door leads to an alley, side door goes to the parking lot. If things go bad, you got options. "You're not coming with me," Robert said firmly. "This meeting is too risky." "Like hell I'm not. You think I'm gonna let you walk into a potential trap alone?" Chloe shook her head. "Besides, you still don't know how to spot trouble the way I do. You need backup." They argued about it for an hour, but Robert eventually gave in. Chloe was right that he still wasn't good at reading dangerous situations, and having someone watching his back made sense. They worked out a plan. Chloe would be inside the diner before Robert arrived, positioned where she could see the whole room and all the exits. If anything looked wrong, she'd signal him, and they'd both get out fast. At 8:30, Robert walked into the diner wearing his cleanest thrift store clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Chloe was already there, sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee and a piece of pie, looking like any other kid whose parents had dragged her out for a late dinner. Jim Hartwell arrived exactly at 9, and Robert almost didn't recognize him. His longtime attorney looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past week. His usually perfect gray hair was disheveled, his expensive suit was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Robert slid into the booth across from him, keeping his voice low. "Jim." The older man stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head in disbelief. "Jesus Christ, Robert. When that girl walked into my office this morning, I thought it was some kind of cruel joke. I know how it sounds." "Do you?" "Because it sounds completely insane. Your own nephew and niece tried to murder you." Jim leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Robert told him everything. The dinner conversation, the meeting at the warehouse, waking up buried alive. Jim listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. "Those little bastards," he said when Robert finished. "I knew something was wrong when Danny came to see me yesterday. He was asking about your will, About what would happen to the company if you were declared dead. What did you tell him? The truth. That there would be a waiting period, investigations, paperwork. But Robert, he seemed awfully confident that those wouldn't be problems. Jim rubbed his forehead like he had a headache. He kept talking about you in the past tense, like he'd already accepted that you were gone. What about the company? What's been happening there? They've moved fast. Faster than I would have expected. Jim pulled out a folder he'd brought with him. Stock transfers, executive decisions, new contracts. All perfectly legal on the surface, but the timing is suspicious. Robert looked through the papers, recognizing Danny's signature on document after document. His nephew had been busy in the week since the burial, consolidating power and making changes that would be hard to reverse. They're not just stealing the company, Robert said. They're reshaping it completely. And they're doing it in a way that suggests they never expected you to come back. Jim leaned back in the booth, studying Robert's appearance. You look different, by the way. Harder. I've learned a few things about survival recently. Good. Because you're going to need those skills. If we're going to take down Danny and Sarah, we need to be smarter than they are. Jim's smile was grim. You think I'm going to let them get away with trying to murder my oldest client? Besides, they made this personal when they lied to my face yesterday. For the first time since he'd climbed out of that coffin, Robert felt a spark of hope. With Jim's help, he might actually be able to reclaim his life and make Danny and Sarah pay for what they'd done. What's our first move? Evidence, Jim said immediately. We need proof of what they did to you, and proof of what they've been doing since. The attempted murder is going to be hard to prove without witnesses, but the financial irregularities might be easier to establish. How do we get that proof? Carefully. Very carefully. Jim glanced around the diner, then back at Robert. They think you're dead, which gives us an advantage. We can investigate them without them knowing to cover their tracks. I've got someone helping me, Robert said, nodding slightly toward Chloe at the counter. She's the one who found me, and she's been keeping me alive since then. Jim followed his gaze and raised an eyebrow. She's just a kid. She's tougher than most adults I know, and she understands how to stay invisible in ways that could be useful to us. If you trust her, that's good enough for me. Jim started gathering his papers. But Robert, you need to understand what you're up against. Danny and Sarah aren't just greedy relatives anymore. They're criminals who think they've committed the perfect crime. If they realize you're alive, they'll try to finish what they started. Let them try, Robert said, and he was surprised by the coldness in his own voice. I'm not the same man they buried. As they prepared to leave, Jim handed him a prepaid cell phone. My direct number is programmed in. Call me tomorrow, and we'll start planning our next move. Robert pocketed the phone and stood up, feeling more like himself than he had in days. Not like the old Robert Mitchell who'd been so easily betrayed, but like someone new. Someone who understood what it meant to fight for survival. Walking out of the diner, he caught Chloe's eye and nodded. She finished her pie, left money on the counter, and followed him into the night. They were a strange team, he realized. A supposedly dead millionaire and a homeless teenager, united by circumstances and a shared understanding of what it meant to have nothing left to lose. But maybe that was exactly what they needed to beat Danny and Sarah at their own game. 3 days after the meeting with Jim Hartwell, Robert and Chloe were sitting in yet another abandoned building. This one a former textile factory on the outskirts of Hartford. The prepaid phone Jim had given him buzzed with an incoming call. We've got them. Jim's voice was tight with excitement and anger. The financial audit turned up everything we needed. Unauthorized transfers, forged signatures, backdated documents. Danny and Sarah have been stealing from the company for months, not just since you disappeared. Robert put the phone on speaker so Chloe could hear. She'd become his partner in this whole mess, and she deserved to know what they'd discovered. How much? Robert asked. Over $2 million, moved through a series of shell accounts. They've been planning this for a long time, Robert. Your disappearance was just the final step. Chloe whistled low. $2 million. That's more than most people see in their whole lives. The really sick part is how they did it, Jim continued. They used your grief over your brother's death against you. Remember how distracted you were after Tom and Linda died in that car crash? How you let Danny and Sarah handle more of the day-to-day business because you were trying to help them through their loss. Robert closed his eyes, remembering those awful months 15 years ago. His younger brother Tom and his wife Linda had been killed by a drunk driver, leaving Danny and Sarah orphaned at 16 and 14. Robert had taken them in, legally adopted them, given them everything. And they'd been stealing from him almost from the beginning. They started small, Jim explained. A few thousand here and there, hidden in legitimate business expenses. But it escalated over the years. By the time they decided to get rid of you permanently, they were already in deep. So what's our next move? Robert asked. That's up to you. We have enough evidence to send them to prison for embezzlement and fraud. The attempted murder charge will be harder to prove, but the financial crimes are airtight. Robert was quiet for a long moment, thinking. A month ago, he would have wanted them arrested immediately, thrown in jail, their lives destroyed as completely as they'd tried to destroy his. But living on the streets with Chloe, seeing the world through her eyes, had changed something fundamental in how he thought about justice. I want to confront them first, he said finally. Robert, that's not safe. If they realize you're alive, they're going to find out anyway when we file charges. But I want to see their faces when they realize their perfect crime wasn't so perfect after all. Chloe had been quiet during most of the conversation, but now she leaned forward. You sure about this, Bob? These people tried to kill you once. They might try again. Not if we do it right. Robert looked at her, then at the phone. Jim, can you arrange a meeting? Make it seem like routine business, something they'd have to attend. I suppose I could call an emergency board meeting. Tell them there are some irregularities in the accounts that need to be addressed immediately. Perfect. But I want it somewhere public, somewhere they can't try anything stupid. The main conference room at Mitchell & Associates, with the whole board present. Robert, think about this. You'll be walking back into your old life looking like. Jim paused, clearly trying to find a diplomatic way to describe Robert's current appearance. Like someone who's been living on the streets for 2 weeks. Robert looked down at his thrift store clothes, his scruffy beard, his calloused hands. Good. Let them see what they turn me into. After they hung up, Chloe studied Robert with those sharp blue eyes that seemed to see everything. You're not really doing this for justice, are you? She said. You're doing it because you want them to know they didn't break you. Maybe. That's dangerous thinking. Revenge makes people stupid, and these two are already smarter than you gave them credit for. Robert knew she was right, but he couldn't help himself. Danny and Sarah had stolen more than his money. They'd stolen 15 years of his love, his trust, his belief that family meant something. They'd made him feel like a fool for caring about them. I need them to understand that they created their own worst enemy, he said. The Robert Mitchell they buried was soft, predictable, isolated from the real world. But I'm not him anymore. The board meeting was scheduled for the next afternoon. Robert spent the morning getting ready, which mostly involved cleaning up as much as possible without actually changing who he'd become. He kept the thrift store clothes, but made sure they were clean. He trimmed his beard, but left it longer than he'd ever worn it before. He looked like a different person, which was exactly the point. Chloe insisted on coming with him, despite his protests. I got you this far, she said. I'm not missing the big finale. It could be dangerous. Everything's dangerous. Besides, you might need backup again. Jim met them outside the Mitchell & Associates building, a glass and steel tower in downtown Hartford that Robert had always been proud of. Now, looking up at it, he felt like he was seeing it for the first time. It was beautiful, impressive, but also cold and isolated from the world around it. Kind of like the man who'd built it. The board is already assembled, Jim told them as they rode the elevator to the 20th floor. Danny and Sarah are here, along with the other directors. I told them this was about financial irregularities, but I didn't give specifics. What about security? Building security, nothing more. If they try anything violent, there'll be plenty of witnesses. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor Robert had once known as well as his own home. The receptionist looked up as they approached, and her eyes widened in shock. Mr. Mitchell? Sir, we heard you were missing. Robert smiled grimly. I got better. The conference room was exactly as he remembered it. Polished mahogany table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The board members were already seated, their faces showing confusion and growing amazement as Robert walked in. But it was Danny and Sarah's reactions that made the whole thing worthwhile. Danny went white as a sheet, his mouth falling open in shock. Sarah actually gasped, her hand flying to her throat like she was choking. For a few seconds, neither of them could speak. Hello, kids, Robert said calmly, taking his usual seat at the head of the table. Miss me, Uncle Rob, Danny stammered, finding his voice first. My God, we thought you were dead. Where have you been? What happened to you? That's a very interesting question, Danny. What do you think happened to me? Sarah had recovered from her initial shock and was now studying Robert's appearance with calculating eyes. You look different, she said carefully. Rough. Like you've been through something terrible. I have been through something terrible. I was buried alive by people I trusted. People I loved. Robert's voice was conversational, but there was steel underneath it. Funny thing about being buried alive, though? It gives you a lot of time to think about your life, about the people in it, about who you can really trust. The other board members were looking back and forth between Robert and his nephew and niece, clearly sensing tension but not understanding what was happening. Robert, said Patricia Wells, the board's longest-serving member, perhaps you should tell us where you've been. We've all been very worried. I've been getting an education, Patricia, learning about the real world, about what it means to survive when you have nothing. Robert looked directly at Danny and Sarah, learning about what family really means. Jim stepped forward and placed the financial audit on the table. Before we get into Mr. Mitchell's experiences, there are some business matters that need to be addressed. It seems there have been some unauthorized transactions during Robert's absence. Danny's eyes flicked to the papers, and Robert saw something that might have been panic flash across his face. What kind of transactions? The kind that send people to prison, Robert said quietly. Tell me, Danny, when you and Sarah decided to steal from me, did you always plan to kill me eventually? Or was that just a spur-of-the-moment decision? The room went dead silent. Patricia Wells looked like she was going to faint. Sarah had gone very still, her green eyes never leaving Robert's face. I don't know what you're talking about, Danny said, but his voice was shaking now. Sure you do. Robert stood up slowly, his gaze moving between his nephew and niece. You drugged me, buried me in a wooden box, and left me to die. Then you came back here and started playing the grieving relatives while you looted my company. That's insane, Sarah said, but she didn't sound convincing. Uncle Rob, you've obviously been through some kind of trauma. Maybe you should see a doctor. I've seen a lot of things in the past 2 weeks. I've seen what real loyalty looks like, what it means when someone helps you without expecting anything in return. Robert glanced at Chloe, who was standing quietly by the door, watching everything with those sharp eyes. I've learned the difference between people who love you and people who just love what you can give them. He turned back to Danny and Sarah, and his voice went cold. I know exactly what you did, and I can prove it. The question now is whether you want to make this easy or hard. Danny looked at Sarah, and some kind of silent communication passed between them. Robert saw the moment they made their decision, saw the shift from shock to calculation to desperate resolve. You can't prove anything, Sarah said, standing up. Whatever you think happened, whatever story you've convinced yourself is true, you have no evidence. Actually, we do, Jim said, opening the audit folder. Bank records, forged documents, unauthorized transfers. $2 million stolen over the course of 5 years. That's not murder, Danny said quickly. That's just business disagreements. You're right, Robert agreed. The embezzlement charges will probably only get you 10 to 15 years. The attempted murder charge, though, that's life in prison. He pulled out the prepaid phone and showed them a recording app that had been running the entire conversation. Funny thing about modern technology. Everything gets recorded these days. The look of dawning horror on their faces was almost worth everything he'd been through. Almost.